Greetings, Wanderers, and welcome back to part 4 of this little series of mine. This week, 5 tips for my fellow dungeon daddies and mummies preparing for their first epic session, where you're off to help 2 hobbits on a magical quest to destroy their One Ring. Wait a second. Is this the right script? But enough of what I got up to last weekend. In all seriousness, while I got back into DMing properly during 2020 and the pandemic, storytelling and RPGs have been a huge part of my life as far back as I could remember. When I was a kid, I knew about Dungeons & Dragons through cultural osmosis. Plenty of little references and jokes on Saturday morning kids' cartoon shows, mainly on Cartoon Network. However, one day, I was taken off to the magical land of Toys R Us, and there, on the shelves, I spotted it. A boxed copy of Dungeons & Dragons the board game, and I begged my parents to pick it up for me. I still have it actually, and even to this day I still use plenty of the miniatures and game boards in my sessions, including Halfwits. Although my naive 12-year-old self hadn't quite clocked onto the fact that this wasn't the real deal. It wasn't until a few months later, when I came across a little-known PC game called Neverwinter Nights, that I realised what Dungeons & Dragons truly was. I was then lucky enough to get my grubby little mitts on the 3 holy texts of D&D 3rd edition, the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and most crucially of all, the Dungeon Master's Guide. Only problem? I'm dyslexic and can barely read the bloody things. Did that stop me? Absolutely not. I cobbled together some well-intentioned but ultimately doomed to fail campaigns for some of my high school mates at the time. And you know what? Some of the ideas that I came up with back then, I'm still actually quite proud of and would love to integrate into some of my games today. I was invited to a few tabletop games throughout my 20s, but let's just say they weren't exactly stellar experiences. Though I did have my own crack at running a Majora's Mask style 3-day time loop campaign that was very Terry Pratchett-esque and filled to the brim with loads of now admittedly very dated pop culture references. And while that was a good laugh at the time, like many of my other campaigns, fizzled out after just a few sessions. But then, 2020 happened. And just like that, I and 2/3 of the planet were locked down. But thankfully, due to the magic of Zoom and advancements in virtual tabletops or VTTs, I was able to turn back to TTRPGs as a way of connecting with my mates. I did briefly try to stage a one-man and his dog production of the complete works of Shakespeare, but Milo kept forgetting his lines. Look, the pandemic was hard on all of us, okay? So I went a bit mad on Amazon, and I picked up 3 different RPG systems. Warhammer Wrath and Glory, Age of Sigmar Soulbound, and of course, the vanilla tentpole monolith that is D&D 5th edition. The idea? Instead of locking different friends groups into a weekly game, because let's face it, even in lockdown, people still had kids and adult responsibilities. The idea would be to run 3 concurrent campaigns, 1 in each system, 1 game a week, rotating between them, with 1 week off in the month to prep. Yeah, well, it seemed reasonable at the time. But as any veteran DM will tell you, that's a fast track to burnout. Especially if you're trying to learn the system and homebrew the campaign. Unsurprisingly, it all fell apart after just a few sessions. But I did learn a lot from my mistakes. And if I could travel back in time and give my younger self some advice, these are the 5 essential tips I'd give to any new aspiring DM. Keep it simple, stupid. You don't need to plan for every situation. So you've got your first game scheduled, with a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed group of new adventurers, and this is your first time behind a DM screen. You've been dreaming of this moment. You've built an epic, open-world, fully fleshed-out, go-anywhere, do-anything fantasy setting, filled with tomes of lore and layers of political intrigue, of rival kingdoms and petty squabbles, not to mention the fact that you've expertly woven in all your elaborate player backgrounds into your grand narrative. You lock yourself away in your dragon's lair, bedroom, obsessing over every tiny little detail. But then, disaster strikes. Suddenly, the game has to get cancelled because one of your players accidentally ran over their neighbour's cat and needs to flee the country. Though, thinking back on it, that one might have just been an excuse. Suddenly, all those mental spoons that you poured into your magnum opus are gone, leaving you burnt out and frustrated and wondering why you even bothered. If there's one bit of advice I can give you, keep it simple, stupid. Manage your scope. Focus on one or two key elements of your game and figure out what type of experience you want your players to have. If you and your players are after a combat-heavy dungeon crawl, then focus on that. Or if you've written a politically charged, intrigue-filled political campaign of shifting allegiances and rival factions, focus on nailing that instead. Or perhaps you've designed an intricate puzzle box dungeon. Then that should be where you put your creative energy. Just like in game development, if you try and focus on a little bit of everything, you end up focusing on nothing. Know what type of experience you want to give your players and lean into it. Number 2. Linear storytelling versus the true sandbox. Ah yes, the true sandbox RPG. The holy grail of TTRPG experiences, and if most people online are to be believed, the only real way to play. Versus its arch nemesis, the railroad. The worst possible experience imaginable, and the subject of countless D&D horror stories. This is probably one of the most misunderstood pieces of advice given to new DMs. I could easily lead you down the path of thinking that you need to give your players as much freedom as possible at all times, never guiding them, narrowing their choices or reining them in for fear of being labelled a railroader. When I was a kid, my dad bought me one of my favourite RPGs of all time, Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. He hyped it up as this epic open world go anywhere do anything style game, and I still remember rocking up on the shores of Ardenfell for the first time, only to wander about aimlessly for half an hour before putting it down again. Couldn't get into it, mate. It wasn't until months later, when a mate of mine down at the local games workshop was explaining all the cool things that you could do in Morrowind and how to get started. It was then I decided to give it another shot. Only this time, armed with a little bit of knowledge and a clear idea of what I wanted to do, it quickly became one of my favourite RPG experiences of all time. And that's the key. While sandbox games can be amazing, as a DM it is impossible to plan for every eventuality that your players might come up with. But think about it from the new player perspective. Too much freedom can be overwhelming, and decision paralysis is very much a real thing. In fact, a true sandbox game flips the traditional D&D structure on its head. Instead of the DM being the one to set up the world and present the player with choices, it's actually much more player driven, with the players more responsible for creating their own fun, and the DM taking a more backseat, passive, reactive role. While this could be a brilliant novel way to play, especially with the right group, it's absolutely not ideal for beginners. I wouldn't even consider this sort of game unless I had an experienced group of players who were intimately familiar with the system and had a clear idea of what type of story they wanted to tell. And that brings me to theme park mode, my personal happy medium. In this model, you, as the DM, create a clearly defined world with manageable parameters, but leave enough space for the players to explore and make meaningful choices. You then set up a few major attractions. Some pivotal scenes, set-piece moments, or key story beats that your players can experience in any order. This keeps the scope of the game manageable, while at the same time maintaining the illusion of total agency for your players. Tip 3. The A-B-C scene structure. This is hands down one of my favourite DMing techniques that I use constantly in Halfwits and my other games. Let's say your players reach one of those set-piece moments we were just talking about. As a DM, you only need to know two things: where the scene starts, point A, and where the players need to end up and what needs to happen before they get there, point C. That's it. Everything else in between, that's point B. And here's the secret: You don't control that part. Instead, populate your scene with NPCs, puzzles and encounters, and bits of the world that your players may or may not interact with. Let them loose, let them bounce off each other and poke at things, and just generally fill up the imaginary faffing about meter in your head. Then, when you feel that they've had their fun and are naturally heading towards the next objective, nudge them along to point C. A perfect example of this is in episodes 4 and 5 of Halfwits, set at the tavern. The scene starts with Wilhelm and Tuppence arriving, and Sigfrid and Reginald are already seated at a table. That's point A. Over the course of the next 2 episodes, I need to get all 4 characters sat round the table, introduce them to each other, and get them to agree to form a party. That's point C. Everything else in those episodes, the conversations, the distractions, the hijinks, those are our point B moments. I didn't script those. I didn't plan those. I just set up a space full of things for the players to poke at and fill in the middle. But here's one of the hardest lessons that I had to learn as a DM. You don't need to have an answer to every problem. It's easy to feel like you should have a solution for every puzzle, every obstacle, or every plot point that your players might come up against. But here's the thing. Your players will almost never solve a problem the way that you initially planned. And if you try and force them down a particular route, well, that's when you risk the dreaded railroad accusations beginning to pop up. Let's be honest, your players will come up with wild, harebrained ideas that by all rights shouldn't work, but they'll want to try them anyway. Like trying to break through the walls of the Imperial Vault instead of solving the intricately designed maze that you just spent 3 hours writing.
I am going to ask this question once. Are you going to try and go round and solve the maze, or are you trying to go through the wall? Through the wall.
Stay tuned to Halfwits for that. Okay, so here's a radical thought. How about you set up a scene with a clear start point and end goal, but have absolutely no idea on how your players are going to get from A to C. Then, as the DM, you just get to sit back and watch your players struggle, coming up with all kinds of creative and radical and completely anarchic plans that you would have never come up with in a million years. And every now and then, one of those wild ideas just might work. Tip 4. Embrace pre-written adventures. Okay, so this one might say more about me than anything, but when I first started DMing, I avoided pre-written adventures like the plague. I fancied myself a decent fantasy writer. I understand things like character motivation, world building and narrative arcs, and I wanted to prove it. So I invested in all the rule books and source materials, but tended to steer clear of any published modules. Spoiler, this is a fast track to burnout. Turns out, running 3 consecutive campaigns at once isn't sustainable. Shocking, I know. But it wasn't until the pandemic was over and life started picking back up again that I wanted to run a weekly game, but didn't have the time or mental spoons to homebrew everything. So I put my pride aside and I finally caved and ran a pre-written adventure. And honestly, it made me a better DM. Just like before, focus on where a scene starts and finishes and understand the key interactable elements in between. And then just relax. Even if your players go wildly off script, as long as you can steer them back to the key story beats eventually, you're golden. The real reason I recommend pre-written adventures, especially those written by the designers of the system you're playing, is because a good one should double as a tutorial. It introduces mechanics in context and teaches both you and your players how to use the system as intended and lets you master the rules organically. And if you come across a mechanic that you really love, save it for your next homebrew and look like an absolute genius. Of course, bad pre-written adventures exist too. Some ignore the game systems entirely, while others are so badly structured that they cause more confusion than they solve. Looking at you, Doctor Who Keys of Scaravor. You'll be getting a kicking later. But even with a pre-written adventure, no 2 campaigns ever play out the same. Every group is different, and you'll find that the moment-to-moment gameplay is unique to your table. Tip 5. Consider shorter campaigns. If there was a theme to my early DMing career, it's that a lot of my early campaigns only lasted for a handful of sessions. They say that your typical D&D campaign should last 20 to 30 sessions and take 1 to 2 years to complete. This is great in theory, but in practice what I found is if you can get 8 to 10 solid sessions in, then you're doing exceptionally well, especially with a group of new players. One of the best bits of writing advice that I ever got was write every season like it's your last. Now, they were talking about TV and film, but the same is true here. Think, how many franchises can you name that have gone on that little bit too long and retroactively tainted the whole thing? Game of Thrones Season 8 ending, anyone? Post-Endgame MCU? A satisfying ending is one of the best parts of any story. Some of the best movies and stories are contained, self-sufficient arcs that wrap up their main plot while still leaving some room for future expansion. Think the original Star Wars or first Pirates of the Caribbean movie. This was my mindset when putting together Halfwits. I knew I only had 3 table sessions to work with and roughly 21 half-hour episodes to tell a complete story. And while I do have some ideas of where to take the story next, if we never return to this world with these characters, the original story will still wrap up and end in a satisfying way. Life happens. Scheduling players is the true final boss of D&D. So why not set yourself a challenge? See if you can tell an entire story in 4 to 6 sessions. Maybe even let your players level up after every game, and that will keep the pace fast and engaging. And then, when it's done, decide what happens next. Do you continue on with the same story? Switch characters? Or maybe take the opportunity to try a completely different system? It keeps things fresh and gives players the opportunity to rotate in and out, as well as stopping campaigns from going stale. You can also experiment with new systems and new characters without the fear of long-term commitment. Bonus, never throw anything away. Final tip, never throw anything away. I've got an old folder full of NPCs, notes, campaigns and mechanics that I liked. And you'd be amazed how often you get the opportunity to recycle an old idea into something new. It's immensely satisfying to run an old adventure for a new group and tweak it based on what worked last time, or have the opportunity to cock it up in new and interesting ways. Plus, you look like a genius being able to pull amazing scenarios out your arse at a moment's notice. Alright, well I hope you found that helpful, and if you did, please remember to like and subscribe, and maybe even check out the Patreon where you can get early access to episode 13 of Halfwits. Next time, I'll be diving into what makes a good pre-written adventure, along with some of my recommendations of some great places to start. Thanks again for watching. Yindy, out.